Hey there, my dear friends. Welcome back to CRYPTID'S Den. I hope you're having a beautiful day with your loved ones. Where are you tuning in from today? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to send a warm hello your way. Alright, enough chit-chat. Let's dive right in. Have you ever seen something that no one else believed was real? In the summer of 1912, the Whitaker family sought nothing more than a peaceful holiday by the still waters of a quiet lake. But as everything changed on a Wednesday morning, when little Ellie stood on the wooden bridge and whispered, "Someone's watching us from the trees." But it wasn't someone, and it wasn't an animal either. It stood tall, motionless, like a statue that breathed. Days later, there were more. Smaller, quieter, like a family. Henry Whitaker never spoke about that summer. Not for 75 years, until now. Through Ellie's journals and a long-lost audio tape from 1987 comes a story never told before. A truth buried deep beneath the silence of Stillwater. What they saw, why they never returned, and what might still be out there, watching. If you skip this, you'll never know. Are we truly alone, or just temporary guests on someone else's land? Henry Whitaker was 88 years old when he finally told the story. He was sitting in a creaky rocking chair on his daughter's porch in Oregon, the sunlight tracing soft gold through the pines. His voice, dry as parchment, still held the slow warmth of Indiana fields. He didn't look at anyone when he began, just stared straight ahead into the trees, as if something might be standing there even now. "I haven't told this story to anyone," he said. "Not fully, not the way it happened. Not until today." That summer in 1912, Henry was only 12 years old. His family, Father James, Mother Margaret, and little sister Ellie, had packed their things into an old wagon and left their farm behind for a week at Stillwater Lake. It was their family tradition, a sacred ritual of sorts. No telephone wires, no neighbors, no calendar. Just the woods, the water, and each other. Stillwater wasn't much more than a clearing by the lake, a handful of old pine cabins, a bait shack run by old Tom Granger, and one long dirt road in and out. The lake itself was glassy and cold, and circled by trees so tall they seemed to scrape the edge of heaven. That first evening, Henry sat on the dock with his father and watched mist rise from the surface like breath from a sleeping giant. The second morning, everything was still perfect. The sun climbed slowly through a veil of clouds, the birds tuning up their dawn chorus. Ellie ran barefoot down to the dock with her tin bucket in hand, eyes set on minnows. Henry followed with their fishing rods, while James walked hand in hand with Margaret, quiet and smiling. They fished until the sun was high, catching more silence than bass, and that suited them fine. Margaret laid a blanket under the birch tree and read aloud. Ellie curled beside her like a cat in a sunbeam. It was peaceful in the way only the past can be. So quiet you could hear your thoughts breathe. Until the first snap came from the trees, just a twig maybe, a branch giving way beneath something or someone. Henry was down by the rocks, skipping stones with James. The sound froze them both. James paused mid-throw, his arms stiff, eyes narrowing toward the tree line. "Probably a deer," he muttered. But Henry noticed something shift in his father's shoulders, a new tension under his usual calm. James kept his gaze on the trees long after the noise faded. Later he claimed he wasn't worried, but even then, Henry knew that wasn't true. That night, they cooked their catch in a skillet over the fire pit. Stars bloomed above them, fat and silver. Margaret hummed an old hymn while rinsing the plates in a tin bucket. Ellie lay with her head on her mother's lap, half asleep. Henry sat close to James, staring into the black between the trees. Something felt off. Not loud or sudden, just off. Like a missing sound you can name. That's when he first heard it. Soft footsteps outside the cabin. Careful, deliberate. Too slow to be wind, too measured to be random. The next morning, Henry told James, who laughed gently. But Henry didn't dream that rhythm. He remembered it like a song. 4 steps, a pause, and silence. That morning, they rowed out early, the lake smooth like a sheet of cold glass. Margaret handed out jam sandwiches from the dock, her fingers brushing Ellie's cheek as she tucked a napkin into her collar. Henry cast his line beside his father, the boat still drifting gently. That's when Ellie called out, "There's someone over there." They turned. She was on the dock, waving, her voice sharp and clear across the lake. Her small hand pointed to the opposite tree line. At first, Henry saw nothing. Just shadows and branches, but then movement. Slow, controlled, like a large man striding behind the trees. But it wasn't a man. It was taller, broader, covered in dark, coarse hair that glinted bronze in the light. It moved with an eerie grace, each step measured. Then it stopped and looked at them, not glared, not growled, just looked. Henry couldn't breathe. James stood slowly in the boat, squinting toward the shore. What in God's name? The thing took one more step forward, revealing its massive shoulders and long arms. It didn't flinch, didn't hide. It knew they were watching, and it didn't care. Margaret had come down to the dock by now, clutching Ellie to her chest. Her voice was thin with fear. Come back now." James didn't argue. He sat down, gripped the oars, and turned the boat. His hands shook only once. They didn't speak much the rest of the morning. No one needed to. There was a silence in their cabin, thick and waiting. A kind of understanding no one dared put into words. It was only just beginning. Later that afternoon, James pulled the old field binoculars from his duffel and sat on the porch for hours, scanning the far bank. Henry watched his father's face, stone still, but something behind his eyes was moving. Henry and Ellie wandered down the shoreline, kicking pebbles and collecting feathers, anything to distract themselves from the weight hanging over the cabin. The wind carried the smell of rain, and thunder murmured somewhere far off. That's when they saw it again. Not the same one. Smaller, softer, half hidden behind a wide pine tree at the forest's edge. It tilted its head at them, curious, almost like a child. Henry froze. Ellie gripped his hand. Then, a second figure, larger, steadier, standing behind the smaller one like a guardian. Neither moved, neither approached. They just watched. And somehow that was worse, because it wasn't fear they gave off. It was thought. Awareness, they were thinking, studying, choosing. Henry and Ellie backed away, slow and silent at first. Then faster, then running. By the time they reached the cabin, breathless and pale, something had shifted inside them. No longer a question of if, no longer about what. Something was in those woods, and it saw them. All of them. For the rest of that day, silence sat with them like a fifth member of the family. James barely spoke, his binoculars pressed to his eyes until the sun sank behind the trees. Margaret kept Ellie close, her fingers restless over the same frayed thread on her apron. Even Henry, normally itching to skip stones or chase dragonflies, felt no urge to leave the porch. They ate supper in near silence, the sounds of utensils on tin plates louder than they should have been. But the forest never stopped speaking. Crickets chirped, frogs bellowed, and somewhere in the brush, something heavy snapped a branch. Not close, but not far either. James flinched, almost dropped his fork. That's when Henry noticed. His father's boots were now by the door, laces tucked in, ready. He always left them outside until now. The next morning came too fast. Mist rolled off the lake in thick ribbons, and dew clung to the grass like tiny eyes watching. Henry helped James push the old rowboat out, while Ellie dangled her legs off the dock, humming some half-forgotten tune. Everything looked the same, but none of them felt the same. As they drifted out into the water, Henry scanned the shoreline. He half expected to see those dark eyes again, peering through the pines. But the opposite bank remained still, unnaturally still. James cast a line. Henry followed suit. The sun rose behind them, warming their backs but never quite reaching their bones. Margaret handed out slices of bread with apple butter, her movements careful, eyes darting toward the trees even when she smiled. Ellie hadn't spoken much all morning. Her gaze flicked back and forth across the water like she was reading something written on its surface. Then, later that day, everything changed again. They'd finished lunch and decided to walk the lake's edge, a habit more than a plan. James carried a small hatchet, just in case, though he never said why. Ellie skipped ahead, collecting feathers, chasing her shadow. Henry followed, dragging a long stick in the dirt behind him like a tail. About 300 yards from the cabin, the shoreline bent into a shallow curve. Trees grew denser there, shadows folding over one another like thick blankets. Ellie froze. Henry caught up to her just in time to see her hand rise, pointing straight ahead. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Half hidden behind a pine was something, not someone, not quite. It stood barely taller than Ellie, covered in softer hair, its shape rounder, less threatening. It tilted its head, mimicking Ellie's motion exactly. Then behind it, another shape emerged, taller, broader, the shoulders too wide for any coat, arms dangling longer than human proportion. It didn't move forward. It didn't need to. It was watching. Henry's throat tightened. His first instinct screamed run, but Ellie reached for his hand and held it firm. The smaller creature took a step forward, not bold but curious. It was close enough now that Henry could see the faint golden sheen of its fur under the dappled light. Then the larger one stepped slightly forward, not to attack, not to intimidate, just to stand between, to guard. That's when Henry felt it. Not fear, not quite. It was something colder, deeper. The knowledge that they were being measured, studied, like specimens in a jar that hadn't been tapped yet. They backed away slowly, keeping their eyes low, steps deliberate. When they were out of view, they turned and sprinted back toward the cabin, lungs burning, Ellie's hands slick in Henry's grip. Margaret was on the porch when they arrived, breathless and pale. She didn't ask questions, just ushered them inside and shut the door tight behind them. That night, they lit the lantern early. James took his seat by the window, binoculars in hand, and didn't move for hours. He refused dinner. Henry saw his father's jaw clenched tight, his fingers white around the frame of the window. Outside, the woods were darker than usual. The frogs had gone quiet. Even the wind held its breath. Then, just before sleep could take him, Henry heard it again, footsteps. But this time, more than one, shifting weight. Leaves cracking. Something brushing wood. Henry held his own breath so tightly it ached in his chest. Margaret lay still on the cot beside Ellie, eyes open, wide, listening. The steps never came to the door. They circled, slow and sure. Once, something tapped the porch rail, a sound so gentle it could have been imagined, but it wasn't. When morning came, they found nothing. No prints, no gifts, no marks. Just the dock, the water, and the sky that pretended nothing had happened. But something had, and it was far from finished. Later that day, as the sun began to sink, Henry returned to the curve in the shoreline. He wasn't sure why. Some instinct pulled him. He half expected to see nothing. But then, caught in a crook between two tree roots, he saw it. A small, smooth river stone, too perfectly round to be natural, and beside it, a feather, bright, clean, placed deliberately. Ellie stepped beside him. She didn't speak, just reached into her pocket and pulled out one of her favorite marbles. Blue glass, swirled with white. She set it beside the feather and stone. Neither of them said the word, but both knew what it was, an exchange. A few minutes later, back at the cabin, James listened without interruption. Then, for the first time since they arrived, he smiled, not fully, not openly. Just enough to crease the edges of his eyes. "They're not animals," he said. "They're something else. A family, maybe, like ours. Just, quieter." Margaret didn't respond, but she reached for Ellie and pulled her close. That night, the woods spoke again. Not in footsteps this time, but in stillness, a kind of waiting. And in that silence, Henry realized something else. Whatever was out there had been here long before them and wasn't going anywhere. It began with the river stone. Not just any stone. This one was round and smooth, the kind of surface you'd find after years of water passing over it. But this one had a line etched across the middle like a faint scar. Too deliberate to be accidental. Henry had found it the morning after their second encounter at the bend in the shoreline, tucked just behind a rotting log, near where he and Ellie had stood frozen only a day earlier. He held it in his hand, felt the cool weight of it, and knew this had been left for them. They didn't speak of it right away. They didn't have to. Ellie placed it carefully on the porch rail like it might disappear if touched too much. Later, she left one of her favorite river marbles in its place, a blue glass orb that had belonged to her since spring. No one told her to. She simply did. By mid-morning, it was gone. In its place, a pine cone, but not just any pine cone. This one stripped of all but 3 perfectly spaced scales, with a single wild blackberry balanced on top. Margaret stared at it for a long time, her hands tight on the dish towel she hadn't realized she was wringing. That was the first trade, and then they kept coming. Small things, bits of wood shaved to points, feathers arranged in spirals, an antler tip polished smooth. Always left just past the edge of the trees, never closer. Always early morning. And every time, someone in the Whitaker family left something in return. A knitted string, a slice of bread, a page from an old storybook with a picture of a rabbit. Each time the feeling grew. They weren't being watched anymore. They were being spoken to. The family began to adapt in quiet ways. James stopped bringing the hatchet on walks. Margaret left extra food out after dinner, wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. Henry found himself pausing more at the trees, not with fear now, but with anticipation. And Ellie began to smile again. Every morning she'd run to the edge of the woods to see what had been left. And sometimes she'd dance, just a little like she used to before school, spinning barefoot in the grass with her arms wide and wide. It was during one of those dances that the small one returned. Lulu. That's what Ellie called her. Not from something she heard, but from somewhere deep inside her, like the name had always been there. Henry had seen her first, peeking just behind the low ferns near the same bend in the shoreline. Not hiding this time, just waiting. The golden-brown shimmer of her fur caught the sunlight in a way that made her look almost unreal. Ellie saw her next and didn't move. She just stared, then raised her hand, not to wave, but to mirror. Lulu did the same. A silent echo. Then, for the first time, Ellie stepped forward, Henry's chest locked tight. Everything inside him screamed to pull her back. But James stood behind them, and he simply said, low and calm, "Let her." Ellie took another step. Lulu didn't move. Instead, she bent slowly, scooped up a flat stone from the ground, oval, striped, and held it out. Ellie reached into her pocket, pulled out a pink pebble polished by her own hands, and placed it on the ground between them. Lulu approached, step by step, and set her stone beside Ellie's, then backed away without breaking eye contact. They stared at each other for what felt like a lifetime. Then Lulu turned and vanished into the trees like smoke. No sound. No trace. Later that night, Margaret couldn't stop staring at the spot where it happened. She made no dinner, just held the stone Ellie had been given and turned it over in her hands. James finally said the words aloud, like a truth too big to whisper. They're not animals. They're not creatures either. They're people, a family. And that was the hook. The moment it became real. Not just sighting, not just shadow, but recognition, kinship. Henry never forgot that night. Not the way the fire popped, not the way the trees seemed to lean closer, as if listening. That was the night they stopped being visitors. They became guests. From that day forward, Stillwater changed for them. More trades happened. Lulu came again, always just for Ellie. They never touched, but their games became mirrored dances. One would move, the other would echo, clap, jump, spin. Each time Lulu laughed, a strange chirping sound that didn't seem to come from her mouth, but from her whole body. Ellie would laugh too, louder, freer. Henry began to notice something else. They were never truly alone. Even when they didn't see Lulu or the larger ones, they felt them. Quiet presence, like breathing behind a curtain. Then came the fish, a single trout, fresh and glistening, laid out on the flat stone by the porch one morning. No bite marks, no signs of struggle, still cold to the touch. James found it, called the others over, and said only, "They're feeding us now." That afternoon, Margaret sewed a small blanket from one of the spare flannels and left it under the birch tree with a red apple and a sliver of honeycomb. It was gone before dusk. And so it went. Two families, side by side, separated by woods and instinct, but drawn together by something older than language. A rhythm, an understanding. Henry couldn't explain it, not even to himself. All he knew was that the woods had eyes, but not the kind that judged or threatened. The kind that saw, that understood. But just when everything felt like it had found its strange new normal, something shifted again. It was late afternoon, the light bruising the tops of the trees gold and red. Ellie and Lulu were mirroring one another again, near the edge of the woods, when a third figure stepped out. Not the large one, not the small one, not the small one. Someone new. Taller than Lulu, thinner, slower, maybe older. It stood behind Lulu, watching, and Lulu stiffened. Ellie froze. Henry watched from the porch, his pulse loud in his ears. The new figure didn't move closer, but its presence changed the air. Heavier, charged. Margaret stepped down the porch steps. "Ellie," she called, voice soft but sharp. Lulu glanced once at the taller figure, then back at Ellie, and backed away. And they were gone. That night no gifts were left. No laughter echoed from the trees. The silence returned, not hollow, but tense, like breath held too long. And Henry realized something was different now. They weren't just being observed anymore. They were being evaluated, and not everyone on the other side of the trees might agree on what to do with them. The day started like any other. Warm sun pushing through the pine canopy, the lake mirroring back the clear blue above. Henry woke to the sound of loons calling out over the water and the smell of breakfast drifting through the cabin. Bacon and flour biscuits, a soft clink of utensils in the old cast-iron skillet. Margaret was humming to herself, quiet and steady, but her eyes kept straying toward the window. James had been up since before dawn. When Henry stepped onto the porch, his father was already seated with the binoculars, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed across the lake like a man watching a slow-moving storm. Nothing had come the night before. No gifts, no sounds, no sign of Lulu. The forest felt different, like something was being held back, waiting. Henry felt it in his chest, the way air feels just before lightning splits it open. After breakfast, Margaret wrapped slices of bread and apple in cloth, tucking them into a wicker basket without being asked. She added a small tin of honey and one of the blue-checkered handkerchiefs Ellie liked to carry. Ellie watched her without speaking, hands folded in her lap. Something unsaid passed between them, an understanding deeper than words. James stood from his chair, stretched his back, and said, simply, "Let's walk." They took the path down along the water's edge, past the birch tree, through the reeds that bent and whispered in the wind. Henry noticed every sound: the crunch of gravel under boots, the distant tapping of a woodpecker, the hush of wind through pine needles overhead. The air was thick, not hot, but heavy, like it was bearing witness. Then, as they rounded the bend near the trading spot, they saw them. Not just Lulu. Not just the Guardian. There were 4 of them now. Lulu, standing closest, her soft golden fur catching the light, her head tilted in that familiar way. Beside her, the larger male, broad-shouldered, posture regal but relaxed. Behind them, a new one, taller than Lulu, shorter than the male, with eyes deep and dark as river stones. And behind that one, a 4th figure, bigger than Lulu, but younger, nervous, half-hidden. They were waiting. Henry's breath caught. Not from fear, at least not the kind he'd known before. It was the weight of the moment pressing down on him, like standing in church just before a hymn begins. James stepped forward first, his hand rising slowly, palm outward. Not a wave, a greeting, a peace offering. The larger male mirrored him, lifting one long arm in return. Henry could hear Margaret's breath behind him, shallow, careful. Ellie stepped forward, the basket in her hands, and knelt to place it on the ground. Then she looked to Lulu and smiled, and Lulu stepped closer. There was no sudden movement, no sound but the breeze and the occasional creak of tree branches above. Lulu reached down, lifted the blue handkerchief from the basket, brought it to her face. She sniffed, then folded it in her hand, clutching it tight against her chest. Ellie giggled, not loudly but freely, and Lulu laughed. It was a soft warbling sound, like wind through hollow wood. It echoed faintly, and it was joined by a smaller chuckle, deep from the belly of the larger male, like rocks shifting underwater. It wasn't human, but it was joyful. Margaret sat down on the grass. She didn't speak, just rested her hands on her knees and watched. The female figure stepped forward then, eyes fixed on Margaret, slow and purposeful. She came just to the edge of the clearing and lowered herself to a crouch. Her hand reached into the basket, fingers long and clawed but careful. She selected a slice of apple, held it in her palm, examined it with silent reverence, then took a bite, and smiled. Not with teeth, not a human smile, but the expression, the softening of the brow, the slow blink of her heavy eyes. It was unmistakable. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Henry watched his father and the male figure now standing side by side, both looking across the lake as the sun shimmered along the water. 2 men from different worlds, saying nothing, saying everything. Ellie and Lulu moved closer. They danced, not in circles, not with wildness, but with rhythm. Ellie would spin, Lulu would copy. Ellie would clap, Lulu would mimic. The young figure, the 4th, watched closely, still hesitant, still unsure. Then, as if deciding, stepped out from the shadow and joined in. His movements were clumsy, but his eyes shone with delight. James turned to Henry and whispered, "Just like us, only older in a way we'll never understand." For a long time, there was only the soft thump of feet on grass, the occasional rustle of leaves, the laughter, strange and lovely, and the beating of 4 hearts in sync with 4 others. It was a communion. They shared food, gestures, time. No words, but language wasn't needed. Margaret passed around more apples. The female creature accepted a second slice. Henry offered a carved stick he whittled, and the young one took it, sniffed it, and let out a curious grunt. And then, just as the sun began to dip behind the treetops, the male stood tall and looked at the sky. It was time. One by one, they rose, the young one first, clutching the carved stick like treasure. Then the female, brushing her long fingers against Margaret's basket before turning away. Lulu lingered, her eyes locked on Ellie. She stepped forward, reached toward her friend, and paused. Ellie extended her hand, just close enough, not quite touching, but close. Lulu held up the handkerchief, pressed it to her own cheek, and then turned. As they vanished into the trees, the larger male stopped. He turned back to James, looked him full in the face, and nodded. It was a slow, deliberate motion. Not a goodbye, a recognition. Then he followed the others, and the forest swallowed them whole. The clearing stood quiet. The last light bled through the branches like candle smoke. No one spoke. No one moved. Henry felt the tears prick at his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. Because in that silence, they all understood something they couldn't name. It was the rarest kind of connection. One built not on words, not even on gestures, but on respect, on presence, on choosing to see each other as we are. No costumes, no stories, just families, just living things, each trying to survive with a little kindness, a little peace. They walked back slowly, shoes soft on moss and leaf. Ellie glanced behind her 3 times. Margaret kept one hand on the empty basket. James looked up into the trees, his lips moving like a prayer. And Henry held that moment in his chest like a second heartbeat. But the forest did not sleep that night. Because somewhere, just past the tree line, something else had seen. And not all eyes in the woods looked back with kindness. It started with a sound that didn't belong to any part of the forest. They thought they knew. Just before breakfast, as Margaret set a plate of eggs and bread on the porch railing, and James stirred the last of the coffee over the embers of last night's fire, it came, clear, low, and hollow. A whistle, not mechanical, not human. It rose from the trees beyond the lake like a slow question, not loud enough to startle, but impossible to ignore. Ellie was the first to react. She turned her head sharply, toast halfway to her mouth, eyes widening. Not in fear, but recognition. "It's them," she whispered. James didn't argue. He only nodded and placed his cup down without a sound. They left the cabin slowly, without speaking, just as the morning fog pulled back like a curtain being drawn. Henry remembered how the dew on the grass chilled his ankles. The air felt expectant, thick with anticipation. Every sound around them sharpened by the hush. Birds didn't sing. Trees didn't creak. Even the lake seemed to still itself. At the bend in the path, just past the birch tree where trades had been made, they stopped. And there they were, waiting, all 4. The father figure stood forward this time, framed by the younger male on one side and the tall, dark-eyed female on the other. Lulu stood closest to the edge, her body still but not tense, her eyes wide and bright. There was no fear, not anymore, just presence. A shared knowing that this meeting was not by chance. Ellie moved first, stepping softly across the grass, her hands empty and open. Lulu met her halfway, just a few feet from the forest's edge. Behind her, the taller juvenile shifted from foot to foot, curious but shy. The air between the 2 girls shimmered with something unspoken. Then came the moment no one expected. The father creature stepped forward, past Lulu, past Ellie, until he stood almost level with James. For the first time, James didn't hold back. He took one deliberate step toward him, close enough that if either reached, they could touch. And then he did something Henry never forgot. He mimicked the whistle, low, breathy, just as he had heard it. And the creature laughed, a deep, rolling sound that seemed to vibrate through the trees. It wasn't mockery, it was approval, and the tension broke. What followed was something Henry could only describe as a day suspended outside of time. No one spoke of staying. No one suggested returning to the cabin. They just remained, together, on the edge of the forest where wild met tame. Ellie and Lulu played a game of mirror steps again. But this time, the younger male joined in. Henry watched them hop from stone to stone at the lake's edge, arms flailing, laughter ringing like wind chimes caught in the breeze. Margaret sat on a large root with the female beside her, close, though not touching. They both watched the children. Margaret offered her a plum from her basket. The creature took it gently, Her fingers long and careful. She sniffed it, turned it over, then bit in slowly. The juice dripped down her chin, and she made a low, satisfied hum. Margaret smiled. James and the father stood side by side once again. This time the old man didn't bother with binoculars. He simply looked. For a while, they both watched the lake. 2 sentinels, 2 fathers. And then James did something else unexpected. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. The creature mirrored him, not with a hat, but with a low bow of the head. Slow, deliberate, respectful. Later, Ellie tried to teach Lulu how to skip stones. Lulu watched intently, her movements mimicking but clumsy. Her first few throws dropped like lead. Then one, just one, glided once across the water. Lulu made a high chirping noise and clapped. Ellie joined her. Their laughter echoed, caught in the curve of the cove like a memory being etched in stone. But then, just as the sun began its slow descent, something changed. The father creature turned his head sharply toward the woods behind. So did the female. So did the younger one. Lulu stopped mid-laugh. A stillness fell. Heavy. And for the first time since morning, Henry felt something different. Not fear, but a shift. James looked to Henry. Henry looked to the trees. There, between 2 trunks, barely visible in the darkening light, another figure stood. Not with the others, not a child, not familiar. Its posture was stiff, watching, not approaching. And it wasn't smiling. The father gave a short grunt, commanding but soft, and the figure retreated, gone. Just like that. But it left a bruise on the moment. Everything slowed after that. The female rose and gently brushed her long fingers against Margaret's knee before turning away. The younger male gave a low whimper but followed. Lulu lingered, standing with Ellie for one more heartbeat. She reached down, picked up a small smooth stone, and placed it in Ellie's hand. Ellie held it tight. Then she stepped back. Lulu raised her hand again, 3 fingers bent like a wave, and turned to follow her family. Henry watched them disappear, one by one, swallowed by the shadows. And when it was done, when the clearing stood empty again, no one said a word. The sun dipped behind the trees. The lake shimmered gold. Margaret stood and dusted her skirt. That one wasn't like the others, she murmured. James didn't respond, because he already knew. Whatever harmony had been built, whatever silent understanding they had fostered, it wasn't universal. Not every creature in those woods wanted peace. And Henry, standing in the hush of the coming night, holding the weight of that realization in his chest, knew one more thing. Tomorrow would not be the same. The morning after the whistle call felt like the forest had turned its back. No gift was left at the birch tree. No footprints in the soft dirt. Not even the quiet echo of bird calls. Henry stood by the water's edge, his eyes following the line of trees where Lou had disappeared the day before. He hadn't told anyone yet, but he'd seen something in her face right before she turned away. Not fear, not sadness. Something else, a knowing, like she understood things were shifting. Margaret was quieter than usual. She brewed tea instead of coffee and kept glancing toward the tree line. The way you glance at the sky when a storm isn't on the radar, but you can feel it coming. Ellie held her stone tight, the one Lulu had given her. She didn't speak all morning. They stayed close to the cabin that day. James did small chores, chopped some wood he didn't need, adjusted the hinges on the shed door that didn't squeak. Anything to keep his hands moving. Henry helped him, but their rhythm was off, like playing a tune they couldn't hear anymore. Around noon, they heard something again. Not a call, not footsteps. Just the sound of something being placed. A soft weight against wood. Henry stepped onto the porch first, and there it was. A braid of wildflowers and twine, laid neatly on the porch rail. Fresh, still damp from morning mist. Tied at the end was one of Margaret's blue hair ribbons, the one she'd wrapped around the basket 2 days before. James picked it up slowly, turned it in his hand like a relic. No note, no message. Just that silent return. Margaret said, "They're saying thank you." But Henry wasn't so sure. That afternoon, Ellie took her drawing book to the rocks by the shore and sketched without talking. Henry sat nearby, watching her pencil dance across the paper, shaping the long limbs of creatures that would never fit into storybooks. James and Margaret sat on the porch, eyes drifting now and then to the trees. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was sacred, protective. Then came the second offering. This time, not left at the birch tree. This one was placed on a stump just behind the cabin, closer than ever before. A fish, fresh, glistening, laid out on a flat rock like it had been presented for display. Henry saw it first. His stomach turned, not from fear but from awe, because it hadn't been caught in any ordinary way. There were no wounds, no hook marks, just stillness. James stepped up behind him. "They're feeding us now," he said. Not with a smile, not with a smile, not with joy, with something quiet. A truth neither of them wanted to say out loud. This was more than trust. It was duty. That night, they left more in return. Apples, cooked beans wrapped in cloth, and the quilt Margaret had been sewing in the evenings. The one she hadn't finished, but offered anyway. It disappeared by dawn, and was replaced the next day by something that stopped Margaret in her tracks. A woven mat, made from pine needles and strips of bark. Beautiful, primitive, and on it, placed gently in the center, was Ellie's drawing. One of the ones she'd dropped days ago, uncreased, unspoiled, returned. Ellie cried when she saw it. Henry didn't understand until that night, when James lit the lantern and they all sat around the table. That wasn't just a gift. It was a promise, a message. We see you. We remember. We keep safe what you give. But peace is a fragile thing. The forest remained quiet. Too quiet. Even Lulu didn't return, though Ellie left drawings near the trees every morning. Henry watched his sister get up earlier each day, checking the stump, then returning with a smaller and smaller light in her eyes. By the fourth day, Margaret said it. "Something's holding them back." James didn't answer. But that night, he stayed up until long after everyone else had gone to bed, sitting by the fire watching the dark. And that's when Henry saw it. A figure. Not the father, not the mother, not the mother, not Lulu. The other one. The one from the trees. Not closer, not clearer. Just there. Standing beyond the edge of firelight. Not moving, but not hidden. Henry couldn't tell if it was watching the cabin or just listening. James stood slow, reached for the old hunting rifle he hadn't touched in a week. Not to raise it, just to hold it. The figure didn't react. It simply turned and disappeared. That next morning, Henry woke early to find his father sitting by the lake, boots off, ankles in the water. The rifle leaned against a log beside him. He looked up and said, "It's not all of them, just one." Henry sat down beside him. "The others still want peace," James nodded. But he doesn't. Later that day, they left another gift. Their last. A loaf of Margaret's molasses bread. A small carving Henry had whittled of a loon. And Ellie's drawing, placed in a cloth bag with a note that just said, "We're not here to hurt you." It was gone by sunset, but nothing came back. The next morning, Henry found fresh tracks near the waterline. Small, familiar. He followed them to the bend in the path, and there, on the stump, was the carving. Returned. Alongside it, another fish, and a small pine cone ringed in red clay. Henry stared at it for a long time. An agreement had been made, but not spoken. It was deeper than words, built on exchange, on restraint, on memory. He carried the pine cone back to the cabin in both hands like it might fall apart if handled wrong. Margaret placed it on the mantel, and they didn't talk about it because the forest had spoken, and they'd been heard. But that night, as the wind moved low through the trees and the lantern flickered against the glass, Henry couldn't sleep. Not because he was afraid, not because he doubted the agreement, but because he knew, deep down, something the rest of them were too tired to say out loud. Some things don't want peace, and the others, they can only keep it for so long. The air the next morning was heavier than any before. It wasn't just the thick stillness of late summer or the gray haze curling in from the lake. It was something in the light itself, something quiet that pressed against the skin like a last touch before parting. Henry woke to it, not a noise, not a smell, just the absence of something that had been there for days. He stepped out onto the porch barefoot, the boards cool against his soles. The forest was still, not silent, no. The wind still moved through the pines in soft sighs. The loons still called in the distance. But the presence that had shadowed their days now felt remote, pulled back, like breath held behind bark and leaf. Ellie was already awake. She stood by the birch tree in her nightgown, her arms wrapped around her sketchbook. She didn't turn when Henry approached. "They're not coming today," she said, not as a question, but a fact. A few minutes later, James came out, tightening the belt on his coat, and Margaret followed with 2 tin cups of tea, already going cool. No one spoke of the night before. No one asked if the thing Henry saw beyond the firelight had come back. They didn't need to. It had been there, and it had looked at them. They quietly. Margaret packed the rest of the bread into a sack. James checked the wagon wheels even though they weren't leaving until tomorrow. The silence between them was not strained, but reverent, cautious. As if they didn't want to say too much and shatter something delicate that still hung between them and the trees. After lunch, James spoke. "We'll, go back one more time. Just the 4 of us. Together." Margaret didn't ask why. She only nodded and took Ellie's hand. They walked slow, every step soft. The path felt longer this time. The bend in the trees that once felt like an open threshold now seemed like a question waiting for an answer. But as they stepped into the familiar clearing, they saw them, all 4. Lulu, standing closest, her fur glowing pale in the diffused sunlight, eyes soft and bright as always. The father behind her, tall and still, his expression unreadable but not cold. The mother beside him, her arms wrapped across her chest as if holding something unseen. And the young male, the shy one, standing further back, only half visible, blinking at them as if he wasn't sure whether to come forward or run. But they were there, waiting. No basket, no gifts, just presence. James raised his hand, slow and steady, and took 1 step forward. The father mirrored him, nodding once. The rest of the family stayed still, but Lulu stepped forward again, this time without hesitation. Ellie met her halfway. She didn't offer a drawing this time. Instead, she unwrapped something from the folds of her sweater. A necklace, twine and buttons, threaded with a single red glass bead she had found by the lake. She held it out. Lulu looked at it, then slowly bent and lifted a long feather from the ground, dark with a streak of white through the center. She placed it in Ellie's hand, and Ellie gave her the necklace in return. That was it. No words, no touch, just a trade, a final gesture. Then Lulu reached forward, not all the way, just far enough that her fingertips brushed the air between them, and let out a sound Henry had never heard before. A low tone, like humming, but with a sadness folded deep into it. A goodbye. Ellie nodded. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She held the feather to her chest and stepped back. The family turned one by one and disappeared into the trees, all except the father. He lingered, looked at James, and then did something no one expected. He raised one hand, not in greeting this time, but higher. A salute, a wave, a signal. Then he turned and was gone. Just like that, Margaret let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. James stood still, his arm half raised, as if frozen mid-gesture. Ellie turned back toward the lake, and Henry followed her, feeling a strange ache in his chest. Not grief, not relief. Something in between. Something that tasted like farewell. That night, the cabin felt larger. Margaret made stew, but no one ate much. The feather sat on the table beside the salt tin. Ellie stared at it until her eyes drooped. Henry carried her to bed. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees whispered in ways that made the fire pop louder. James sat near the hearth, staring into the flames. The empty rifle leaned beside him again, not as warning, but as memory. Henry woke once in the middle of the night. The room was dark, except for a sliver of moonlight through the window. Something moved outside. Not footsteps, just a shift. A branch bending, a breath too close. He didn't rise, he just listened. And then, softly, he heard it. That same tone Lulu had made, carried by the wind. And then nothing. At dawn they packed, loaded the wagon slowly. James stood at the edge of the lake for a long time, looking back toward the tree line. Margaret stood beside him. Ellie knelt by the birch tree and buried the necklace string under a pile of stones. No one said it, but all of them knew they were leaving more than just a lake behind. They were leaving something sacred. As the wagon rolled down the dirt path, Henry turned back. Just once. He didn't expect to see them, and he didn't. But somewhere in the stillness between trees, he felt it again. That they had been seen, that they had been remembered, and that, in some way, only the forest could understand. The Whitakers had been accepted, but not by all, and not forever. Because the ones who keep peace are not always the ones who decide how long it lasts. Time has a way of making even the most vivid memories feel like dreams. Soft at the edges, worn smooth by retelling or silence. But not this one. Not for Henry. He carried that summer with him like an invisible thread. Something woven deep into the lining of his life. Decades passed. The war came, and he served in Europe. He married a girl from Iowa, had children, built a business, bought land, buried his parents. But through it all, in the quiet places between words and work, the forest never left him. Stillwater became a name he didn't speak, not because he was afraid, but because it didn't belong to the world he now lived in. It belonged to something older, something sacred. And he had made a promise, one spoken without language, one sealed in silence. Don't disturb them. Don't reveal them. Let what's peaceful remain hidden. It was only many years later, when his daughter Sarah found the pine cone in a box marked Summer 1912, that he told her anything at all. Just enough to make her curious. Just enough to warn her never to go there. She didn't listen. The voice of Sarah Whitaker cuts in now, years after her father's passing. Calm, steady, but with a tremor that only the truly shaken can hide behind grace. I was 38 when I went to Stillwater. I had to see it. My father, he never said much, but the way he didn't speak, that was louder than anything else. I found the cabin. It was still there. Old, leaning, but real. The birch tree too, and the lake, it looked just like the photos I'd seen, but I felt it. Even before I stepped out of the car, I felt them. The silence wasn't empty. It was occupied. She pauses. I didn't stay the night. She found the stump, the old stone where her Aunt Ellie had placed drawings. She left a feather from her father's old fishing cap. Nothing happened. No movement. No gift. But that night, in her motel room 20 miles away, she woke at 2:13 a.m. The feather was on the windowsill. That's when she knew. Henry had written notes. Not many. Just enough. He never called them creatures. He called them neighbors. Once he wrote. They were never hiding. We were just never quiet enough to see. His handwriting changed after 1945, more angular, as if he was trying not to remember. And yet every few years, tucked in the back of journals, were entries dated midsummer. Notes like, "She's still watching," or "The peace still holds." But something has changed. Sarah found a page that chilled her. The last one he ever wrote about Stillwater. It read, "He's back. The tall one. The one who never looked at Ellie. I saw him last night just beyond the orchard. He didn't move. Just stood there. But I think he saw me this time." Henry never wrote another word about it after that. Sarah says he didn't sleep the night before he died. He sat on the porch in his robe, staring at the tree line. She found his mug, cold coffee still inside, his old binoculars slung around the armrest of the rocking chair, and his boots by the door, laces tucked in, ready. Ellie, now old and nearly blind, spoke once about that summer, just once. She said they weren't monsters, not even close. They were family, just not ours. Then she held her feather, still kept in a velvet box, and added, "And the ones who didn't like us, they weren't evil either, just scared, like we'd been the first time we saw them." There's a tape recording of Henry, late in life. His voice is soft, a little frayed. "I used to wonder if we'd made it up, if it was just a boy's fantasy, dreamed up from too many campfire tales. But then I remember the weight of that feather in Ellie's hand, the way the air changed when they came close, and the look in my father's eyes when that last one stood across from him. He wasn't afraid, but he was aware. That's what I remember most. That awareness, that accounting." Henry never returned to Stillwater. He never allowed anyone in his family to buy property there, and warned his grandkids to never go off-road if they traveled near the area. But sometimes, when Sarah took long drives into the woods of Oregon or Northern California, she'd see something in the brush. Just a flicker, a shadow out of sync, and she'd stop breathing for a second. Once, she left her car and stood at the edge of a dense patch of pine. Didn't call, didn't ask, just listened. And the forest listened back. She never tells anyone what she saw that day, not exactly. But she leaves offerings now. Berries, bread, a child's drawing folded neatly in a tin, because some promises echo louder than words, and silence, in the right places, becomes language. The Whitakers never wanted to become a legend. They never asked to see what others wouldn't believe. But once you've been seen by something other, you don't get to unsee it. Stillwater is just a name on a map now. But if you find the cabin, don't knock. And if you hear the whistle, don't answer. They remember. And not all of them have forgiven. Henry was 88 the last time he stood on the edge of Stillwater. His daughter Sarah had brought him back. Not because he asked, but because she knew he needed it. The cabin was long gone, swallowed by time and moss and silence. But the birch tree still stood, taller than memory, its bark papery and peeling like it had something left to say. They parked the car just off the old trailhead, and Henry, slow now, thin but still sharp, walked the last 100 yards with her hand on his elbow. He didn't speak, not until they reached the lake's edge. Then, in the kind of voice you only use when you're afraid you'll break if you don't whisper, he said, "They never left." Sarah didn't ask who they were. She already knew. The water was still, just like it had been that summer. The pines leaned in, and the air tasted of damp earth and something older than roots. Henry knelt down, slow, stiff, and placed a single stone on the stump where Ellie had once traded her drawings. It was smooth, polished, black with a red stripe down the center, a stone that didn't belong here. "I brought this back," he said. Sarah watched him. He hadn't cried at her mother's funeral, hadn't cried when the doctors gave him the news. But now, as the wind stirred through the pine boughs above them, he did, not loud, not broken. Just enough to wet his cheeks and catch on the back of his voice. I hear them sometimes, he said. Still. At night, when the world gets too quiet. A few minutes passed. A branch snapped somewhere in the trees. But it wasn't threatening. Just present. Then Sarah saw it. Something placed on the far end of the stump. A pine cone. Not one then brought. Fresh. Still sticky with sap. Tucked inside it, twined through the open bracts, was a small strip of blue cloth. She knelt. Picked it up. It was faded. Frayed, but unmistakable. Margaret's ribbon. Henry didn't flinch. He only nodded. They remember. For a moment, neither of them breathed. Then came the sound. Soft, low. Carried by wind, or memory, or both. A whistle. Not sharp, not demanding. Just a sound that said, "We see you." And then, as quickly as it came, it faded. The trees held their breath again. The lake didn't ripple. Sarah reached into her coat pocket and took out a folded napkin. Inside it was a drawing. Ellie's last one, copied from a photograph Henry had kept in his desk for 50 years. She placed it next to the pine cone, tucking the corner beneath it. And then they turned to leave. But just before the path curved and the birch disappeared behind them, Henry looked back. He raised his hand, not high, not broad, just a slow motion, fingers lifting as if to say, "Thank you," Sarah asked him that night, sitting by the motel window. "Do you think they ever watched us all these years?" Henry didn't look at her when he answered. "I think they always have. But they only show themselves when they choose to be seen." A few weeks later, Henry passed away, quietly, in his sleep, in the very chair he had rocked his children in years ago. Sarah found the ribbon on the nightstand, laid out flat, like it had just been ironed. She buried it with him. Stillwater is just a name now. The road is barely a path. The maps don't show the cabins anymore. But if you go, if you find it, if you stand still long enough and quiet enough, you might hear it too. That whisper in the trees. Not a threat, not a call, just a reminder that the world is bigger than we admit. That some truths don't belong in books or headlines. That peace can be real, if we let it be. And that some stories, no matter how impossible, should be kept not because they are secrets, but because they are sacred. So, if you ever find yourself by a lake called Stillwater, and the wind shifts just so, and the forest hushes in that strange, reverent way, don't run, don't speak, just listen, because something might be listening back. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough. In the end, this is not a story about monsters. It never was. It's a story about how easily we forget to look past fear, about the quiet things that live at the edges of what we understand, watching, waiting, never asking for recognition. It's about the bridges that can form in silence when judgment is replaced with observation, when suspicion gives way to respect. And maybe most of all, it's about the sacredness of keeping something untouched by the noise of the world. There are places in this country, deep in the woods, along rivers that no longer have names, where things older than language still move. Not because they're trying to stay hidden, but because they know some truths can't survive the spotlight. And sometimes, the greatest kindness we can show is to not demand answers, to leave mystery intact, to honor what isn't ours to possess. What makes us human isn't how much we know, or how far we can reach, but how gently we can exist beside the unknown, how willing we are to live with unanswered questions, and how deeply we can listen before we speak. In that stillness, in that humility, something extraordinary can happen. Understanding without agreement, connection without conquest. A truce between worlds built not on treaties, but on trust. And maybe that's the lesson. Not every miracle needs a headline. Not every truth needs a witness. Some stories are meant to live in the space between certainty and wonder, in the hush beneath the trees, or the ripple on a still lake at dawn. There, in those forgotten corners, you just might find something not meant to be proven, but preserved. So tonight, as the world hums along with its noise and momentum, maybe leave a little room for quiet, for listen, for honoring the invisible. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones we choose to carry gently and never tell. Thank you for taking this journey with us. If this story stirred something in you, something quiet or curious or simply human, leave us a comment. Tell us what you felt. Subscribe to the channel, follow for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who still believes that the world holds secrets worth keeping. Your voice helps these stories live on. And above all, stay curious, stay kind, and never stop listening.